Welcome to the State of Education. I am your host, Melvin Adams, and you are listening to Noah Webster Educational Foundation's podcast. And this morning, I am really delighted to have a guest with us. Her name is Shelly Norden. Shelly is from Virginia, and she is from the county of Fauquier, up kind of in the northern part, north central part of the Commonwealth. Shelly is a well, I guess I would say she is an award-winning educator. And so happy to have her with us. And she's got a lot of things that she's going to share with us. So stay tuned. And so welcome, Shelly. Glad to have you with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
So before you went into education, you were in journalism or in media for a while, right?
Yes.
Tell us about that real quick.
I grew up in Fauquier County, and during high school, I took a journalism class and fell in love. I mean, that was what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. So after high school, I went to George Mason University and majored in communications. Um, After graduating, I went down to West Palm Beach, Florida, and I was a producer for CBS News and Fox News. They were both run out of the same station, but they were
Hmm.
affiliates. So I,
Okay.
I did that for about 5 years, loved it, but it becomes your life. When there were
Mm.
hurricanes, you were packing your bags and going to work and sleeping next to your anchors. So at a certain point, I just got, I was watching a lot of people kind of go through some major life changes while they were working there and thought, I don't know if this is what I love it, but I don't want this to be my entire life.
Yeah.
So I decided to go back to school to become a teacher.
Hmm. And then you moved back to Virginia, right? And
I
started teaching
did.
in Fauquier County.
I did. I moved
All
back
right.
in 2002 and began teaching in Fauquier County. I taught all the publications classes, so the newspaper, the yearbook. I taught film
Hmm.
analysis. I taught 12th grade English. My newspaper, the online journalism piece and the newspaper were both ranked in the top five in the Commonwealth. We had a daily broadcast show that we did that was also award winning. The yearbook was fantastic. I mean, things were going really well. But then they took a turn in 2017.
So, but was it in 2016 that you won Teacher of the Year award?
Yes, in 2016, I was named Teacher of the Year for my school. I
Uh
was
huh.
also named Teacher of the Year for our local VFW, one of their branches. So that was a
Okay.
real honor.
Well, congratulations on that,
Thank
and
you.
that's a big success, and I know you were proud of that. But you said in 2017 things started to change, and what happened?
The first thing that happened was the principal that I had was hired to be the new superintendent over instruction. That a lot of people started talking when that happened, just because he had no instructional background. So people wanted, they couldn't understand why we were putting in a person in this position, making them in charge of every instructional decision in the county when they had never taught a class. So a lot of people were questioning why that happened.
Hmm.
And then I started to see the entire county kind of take a shift, and I started hearing a lot about this word equity. So when you first hear it, and when it's presented, it sounds fantastic. It's like, yeah, everybody, deserves an equal opportunity to learn. That's every kid should be entitled to that. But when
Hmm.
they are defining equity, they're defining it as not equal opportunities to learn, but equal outcomes. So in order to achieve those equal outcomes, they start dumbing down the education so that everybody is going to achieve at the same level.
So everybody gets the trophy, whether you show up or do anything or not. In essence.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
Yes. Yep.
Okay, and so you know. Yeah, that seems to be a problem. I think most parents would have a problem with that. Obviously, I think everybody is supportive of kids getting an opportunity. That's what education should be, and certainly what public education is supposed to make possible, so that everybody that lives in the educational area there uh, has opportunity to go to school and get a quality education. Um, Now, so you said things started to shift. You started to see quite a shift. So that shift in policy, what did you start to see out of that?
Essentially the dumbing down of the education system. The first thing that happened was the homework policy. You weren't allowed to give, I think it was, homework can only count as 10% of the grade. You couldn't give it over weekends, and you couldn't give it over, holidays. So when
Hmm.
you've got classes that are more advanced, that really, the kids need to do more work outside of school to kind of keep up with the curriculum.
Right.
So that was the first thing. The second, before, when you would take an AP class or an honors class, you used to have to get a teacher recommendation. That they did away with that. So that was
Okay.
another thing that changed kind of right off the bat. And it hurt AP teachers because there were all these kids that were taking the class that really weren't prepared to be in that class, and they weren't willing to do the work. So it was slowing down the class, reducing
Hmm.
the rigor of the class. So
Hmm.
it just really started to hurt. Some of these policies really started to hurt the education system.
Well, so what did you, I mean, how did you react? I mean, did you see that in your own classes, or was it just something you were seeing and hearing across the board and from some of your colleagues?
A little of both. I think it started off, I wasn't teaching any of the AP classes, so I didn't really see it at the beginning. But when the homework policy came down, I heard from students who were impacted by it, how that they were upset about it. Um, and that, well, I don't know. I really started looking into. So in 2017, we have what's called the teacher convocation. So when you go back to school at the beginning of the school year,
Hmm.
everybody gets together, for the annual convocation. So in 2017, and that was the same year that they hired Mr. Warner. In 2017, that the theme of that conference was equity. So, and I've got some video that I'll share with you all. And what really struck me with that video was it was all about black and white. It didn't address kids with special needs,
Hmm.
so socioeconomics. It really was just black and white. So that was when I really got a glimpse of kind of where we were heading with this equity piece. And so after convocation, they hired another person as the supervisor over science and PE. After she was hired into that position, she received another responsibility, and that was to be the lead for deep equity. So now we've gone from equity to deep equity, and I start researching deep equity to see what that's all about.
Tell us more about that for those that aren't familiar with that.
And so deep equity is a program that, and they were doing it in Fauquier and Winchester and in Arlington, I believe. And they spent about $75,000, I think, on this program. And basically what they take a group of people and they train them. And then those people come back into all the schools, and then they're supposed to train them from there. So that's kind of how it funnels down. But what really
Mhm.
struck me was some of the things that he said. So when I was researching Gary Howard, he had something called the Conference on White Privilege. And then this is a little bit of what I read. Part of this need is generated by the growing evidence that many white Americans may not be comfortable with the transition from their dominant status. As our population becomes more diverse, we have seen an alarming increase in acts of overt racism. The number and size of hate groups in the United States is rising. Groups such as the Aryan Nation, neo Nazis, and skinheads tend to play on the anger, ignorance, and fears of the more alienated, disenfranchised, and uneducated segments of white society. Um, and then he went on to say, too many segments of our white American population remain committed to their position of dominance. They are willing to defend it and legitimize it, even in the face of overwhelming evidence that our world is rapidly changing. Taken as a whole, these realities strongly suggest that a peaceful transition to a new kind of America, in which no ethnic or cultural group is in a dominant position, will require considerable change in education and deep psychological shifts for many white Americans. And it goes on and on from there. But
Yeah.
when I read that, I mean, it was eye opening. I'm like, what is this, and why is this even being taught in our schools.
So this was being taught primarily at this point then to teachers so that teachers could teach it to their classrooms. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
That yes, at the beginning it was, and one of the things that the school system kept saying was that it was never taught to students. Well, also in 2017, they encouraged teachers to start using Twitter. So if anybody wants to know what's happening in their schools, they need to get a Twitter account and follow the teachers, the principals, because that they provide everything pretty much right there. So when I went on to Twitter, I saw the person that was the lead for Deep Equity teaching deep equity to a group of students at a high school, a local high school. And the picture is right there with them being taught implicit bias. I mean, all these elements that are part of deep equity.
Let me just kind of pull this in for just a second here, because we're getting into terms and things that started to happen. And so, what I'm hearing you say is what you started to see was that some new teaching started to come in that were basically focused on, uh, you know, targeting particular racial groups, separating people by race, and and shifting, trying to shift a mindset so that people, particularly of a white race, um, would accept the fact that they were not going to be a majority or a dominant race in the future of America and so forth. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yes, that was the research that when I was researching this topic, that was what I was reading and the research that I
Hmm.
was doing, and was
Hmm.
honestly shocked that this was even being presented. I mean, Fauquier County is a pretty conservative county for the most part.
Right.
So for that to even come into this county, it was just eye opening. It was almost like waking up in the twilight zone.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting. A lot of people are don't realize this, but this kind of stuff, as you said, has been going on for a while, and actually were the seeds being planted, which then sprung up in more in the last couple of years, the whole concept of critical race theory, which we've heard about ad nauseum. This is really the seeds of that being planted into the system. Um, and it was being done not just in certain urban centers or whatever, but it was being done largely across the board with particular school systems, kind being the pilot projects. Is that what you experienced?
Yes. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And people at that point, it was pre-COVID. So, most families, you've got two parents who are working and they didn't have time to really pay attention to what was happening in the school system. So it was very easy to kind of push this through under everybody's radar. And that's
Hmm.
essentially what was happening. So that's why I felt the need to speak out about it, because I wanted people to know, that this is what's coming into our schools.
So at that time, you began to speak out about it. Is
Right.
that correct?
Yes. Yes.
All right. So tell us about that and tell us what some of the results were.
So when you become a teacher, and I think it's probably true for any government employee, and you're signing a contract, you sign something saying that you're not going to speak badly about the system, essentially. So
Hmm.
I thought, because I lived in the county that I worked in and I was a taxpayer here, that I wouldn't speak out as a teacher, but I could speak out as a taxpayer. So that was kind of the approach that I took. And I started to do some research. And what I found was that when that conversation about deep equity started, prior to that, SOL scores for every demographic were rising. When deep equity entered the picture, the SOL scores for every demographic began to fall. So that was interesting. And at the same time that all of these scores are falling, our county kept pitching the fact that we've got record graduation rates. So it's like, this doesn't add up. What's going on here, and why aren't people asking these questions? So that was one of the big things that I noticed. Then around 2019, we started to have record numbers of teachers just leaving the system for various reasons. And it's just gotten progressively worse. Well, this
Mm.
year, right, currently we've got 50 unfilled teaching seats for the 2021-2022 school year, which is almost over. And in February, another 31 teachers quit the school system. So we've only
Mhm.
got, 800 school teachers total. So what's happened, they've brought in all of these teachers. Basically, you've got warm bodies right now in a bunch of classrooms. You've got kids that are sitting through Algebra 1 classes with teachers who don't know Algebra 1, or kids that are sitting through French classes with teachers who don't know that language. So that's really, so when you're talking about equity and what kids deserve, I think that every student deserves a qualified educator in front of a classroom so that they're given that same opportunity to succeed. If my child has got an Algebra 1 teacher who knows algebra and yours has a long-term sub, how is that, even going back to their term, equitable? You're not going to get the same outcome because mine
Right.
mine is going to come out knowing algebra and yours is not.
Hmm.
So I mean, that's kind of the way that I approach this whole thing, which is, saying, look, this is what we need to do to fix the system. It's not this thing with deep equity and the fact that you've got a bunch of white people oppressing, black students, or I just thought it was crazy, and that nobody was looking into the real issues that were happening in the system.
So what I'm hearing then is that under the guise of equity, uh, basically concepts were being planted that were dividing communities, and and not only that, um, what started happening was people started leaving the system because they did not approve. Many teachers, and I've talked to many teachers who said, "Wait a second, I don't like this." And it's not the race side of the thing. It's just the whole concept, the breaking down, literally the breaking down of an appropriate way of uh, bringing qualified faculty and teachers and so forth, and making sure that those students actually get to receive instruction from somebody who's knowledgeable, who has some experience, and who can actually help them succeed in that subject matter. But since that was no longer really the focus was no longer achievement, but outcomes uh, that were unified across the board. It kind of, and of course, we know that so much of this comes out of kind of a socialist, communist kind of a mindset. It really does. And, I'll just throw this in for free. I grew up in East Africa, and while over there the country went through a Soviet type revolution, and basically Soviet style communism came into that country. And what they were promoting was that it was going to make everybody equal. It gave everybody, they were all going to be on the same playing field. The rich weren't going to be rich anymore, the poor weren't going to be poor, and everybody was going to be of equal status. Uh, Unfortunately, what we saw in that unfold in that country, and what we see unfold in every country that really pursues that concept to its end, is that it drags everybody down until pretty much everybody is at poverty level. And there's no more stuff and there's no more opportunity. And so, yep, we have an equal outcomes. And so what I'm hearing you say is, to some extent, that's what was being introduced into our schools.
Yes, and I'll tell you another great, a person who's got a great story about similar to what you were just talking about. She Van Fleet. I don't know if you're familiar with she. She's the one who spoke out at the Loudon School Board meeting
Yeah.
about the Cultural Revolution that she lived through in China, and just the commonalities between what we're seeing here and what she went through as a young girl. Even using the term woke, they identified people as the most woke, which is very similar to what we're doing here and now. So it's eye opening. It's scary, the direction that we're headed, and I hope that more people are willing to take a stand and say, this isn't where we want to go. This isn't what we don't want our kids being indoctrinated, and it's got to stop.